chat. All right, so what I've done is, let's see. Am I actually streaming? Let's double check. Yep, says we're good. All right. So what I've done is I opened up, here we go. I opened up, this is Ethan's code, but whatever, right? They all should have ended up the same way. And what I wanted to talk about, a couple of things, was um, the collision thing. So we had a couple of pieces of code, so I need to edit code so I can actually make changes. When you do that, it makes a copy of Ethan's project, so like I can edit the code without screwing up his stuff, right? But okay, so this little thing right here. So you had several of these, right? On sprite of kind player overlaps other sprite of kind enemy. All right, so destroy other sprite, and um, this is with so this is if you run into an enemy, right? It destroys the other sprite and changes your life by, well, in this case, 0, so nothing happens, but we obviously could change that. So what I wanted to talk about specifically was where it says sprite and other sprite. Okay, so those are actually kind of variables in a sense, right? But is there an enemy called other sprite? No. But when you use this and you just click and pull it out to put it in a little socket there, and then you can get rid of it there. So, right, when you first made that little block, there was nothing there, okay, to destroy. Or if it was, it might have said my sprite, which is the sort of initial default thing. So what you do is, right, you dragged this thing into that little socket. And what this does is there isn't an object called other sprite, but what it sort of takes the place of is which thing did you run into, right? Which enemy, which object. So, maybe it was enemy sprite 1, maybe it was enemy sprite 200, who knows, right? But whichever one it was is the what sort of gets filled in there in the other sprite thing. Okay, so it's sort of an indirect reference, if you will. Does that kind of make sense? Question?
I did notice something when I was working on it last night, where as I was going through the things, like the different like stages of the assignment, it didn't like exactly state my progress, and like some things were a bit different. Like there, for example, said change log by 0 when it should be -1.
Right. Okay. So
I saved it and sent it to you, and it worked fine on my computer, and somehow it changed it when I sent it to you or shared it. So I have no idea.
that's weird. Yeah. Um, well, okay. So one thing I did notice, talking back and forth with somebody yesterday, was that if you share it and then you make a change, it doesn't point to it. Like the link isn't permanent in a sense, right? So it saves basically the copy right when you share it. That's what gets shared. So like if you shared this right now and then changed the change life by 0 to something else, then you've got to reshare it to get a new link. Okay, that I don't know why they did it that way. That's really silly, but it is. Okay. Um, right. So I think there's a couple people that like I kicked it back to you, and you're like, oh, wait a minute, I thought I did, and you have to. We figured out you basically have to reshare it to get a new link. So that's unfortunate that it is that way. I think Scratch handled this better, where it was the link to the project was permanent. And the only way you would need a new link is if you made literally a new project. So, right, okay. Now right. So change life by 0. Well, clearly Clearly, what do we want there? Right, -1. Okay, and then the other thing is, yeah, so -1. Um, but one other thing to point out there is notice how um, there isn't actually code that says when your life hits 0 in the game. That's actually built into the engine. So it's nice you didn't have to do that manually, but because it's built in. So the other thing is notice how it doesn't actually display your health until from the get-go until you hit something. All right. So why is that the case? All right. So where is the basically what we want to do is say display the health um, from the get-go. Okay. So I think is it under here? Yeah. Countdown, multiplayer, score, life. On life 0, okay, it does, by default, it does game over. But if you put something else there and you use one of those things, then you could do something else. So, like, you could make your own game over screen if you wanted for whatever reason. Okay. Um, but where is it that, do we ever set the life to a default value? No, okay. But if we did, so let's set the life, so it defaults, I think, to 3, okay? But let's say that we put that there, okay? Then if we tell it a specific value of the initial health, then the health bar is there from the very beginning. So it doesn't just appear when you uh, when the health status changes. Okay, so couple kind of little things. The status bar thing, did that kind of make sense how that worked? Yeah, hopefully. So it's got the ticker thing, so it changes, right? And then here, right, the update on game update. So this is something that would happen every 500 milliseconds or half a second. Uh, you could crank that up to be a higher value, but what's going to be the problem if you have too many of those or you crank it up too fast? Well, right, you'd have enemies everywhere, but also if you have too many things going on, it's going to run slow, right? And you're going to get cyberpunk, right? So, um, okay, with the T-pose and the whole, yeah, other things. So I'm just going to wait until this summer when they finally have their all the bugs squashed, and then we can do it for real. So, okay. So, right. So one sort of unfortunate aspect of the block-based coding is notice how it's kind of busy on the screen, right? And it's not particularly like there's not a really good way to organize it, particularly if what happens if you decide, oh, I want to put like 10 other things here, then I got to move this and stuff's all over the place. Okay. We are going to have that same problem with Blueprint, um, that it's going to be kind of hard to visually keep track of things. Now, on with Blueprint, the sort of, well, okay, so with this, the natural flow direction for a piece of code is vertical, right? Because things happen one after another vertically. So if I wanted to be really organized, I would probably put all the different things aligned horizontally so that the code runs vertically. Okay, in Blueprint, it's the opposite direction. The natural flow direction is from left to right, and so you would have chunks of code laid out vertically. We'll see that when we get into Blueprint. Okay, so pretty fun little game. Those of you who did Scratch, way easier in some respects, right? Than having to do some of this stuff in Scratch. Um, Right. Yeah. So in fact, let me just open up Word and let's make a list here. Um, was being Mr. Pine, huh? Oh, yeah. Okay, so let's just make a little list here. What can we add? Okay, go ahead.
My idea was like an ammo meter.
Okay.
Like a start screen or menu screen.
Okay.
I was thinking make like more visually pleasing and more colors.
Okay. More colors, better art. Okay. Now there is somewhat of a limitation there because um, the sprites can only be so many pixels,
Oh, really?
right? So like we don't have 4K graphics here, right? Like so there is a colors wise, yeah, there's a lot of room that we could do it, but in terms of like it's gonna be kind of pixelated, right? I mean that's sort of what it was designed to do. So yeah, okay, go ahead.
A few accessory sounds like the enemy mouth and the bullets being fired.
Okay, because right now there aren't any sounds at all, right? By default, that it didn't have anything in there. Ethan,
Score and high score.
score and high score. Okay,
The boss.
right. Boss or other levels, right? So you could like run into a boss, and then after you get the boss, you go to level 2, which is new enemies that are harder or something. I don't know, right?
Kind of wish a way to win. Because right now it just kind of goes on forever.
Right, okay. So there is no win mechanic. There's a lose mechanic. And so in this case, the winning would be, and this kind of goes to the score or high score thing, right? That winning is more like just staying alive for as long as possible. But since there's no score mechanic yet, or timer or something, then, right, there's nothing to do there. And sorry, I wanted to start singing disco songs just then. No, staying alive. Well, or the song from Portal, right? Still alive. This was a triumph. No. Making success.
I know it now, though.
Yeah, well, it's listen to the real thing. It's much better than right. There's a reason I'm a math professor and not like an opera singer or something. Okay, so some sort of way to win, which gets into the high score. What else could we do? I mean, that's a pretty comprehensive list, right? So one thing I was thinking were different weapons. Okay, so like a lot of these games, like you start out with basically a pea shooter, and then you get a thing where it's like 2 pea shooters, and then suddenly there's a thing where it's like you shoot 1 forward and 2 sideways, or whatever, right? So different weapons. Anything else that we could do? Yeah.
Maybe like enemy health.
Okay. Yeah, enemy health, and that's something that we'd have to worry about with the boss for certain, right? Because right now the enemies are 1 hit, right? Does it? And that's that. Okay, so that's a pretty good list of stuff. All right. So what I'd like to basically do for the rest of class is come up with a new mechanic, and now we don't want to like a good game, right? We would add all this sort of stuff to it. But you don't want to try and do all of those simultaneously because you'll overload yourself cognitively. So pick something that you want to start working on to add, okay, and let's work on it, okay. And then if you finish one, so like for example, the sounds, right, probably won't take that long to come up with a few things. And then keep working on, pick something else to do, okay? Now, for a few things that we'll have to kind of worry about, so let's talk, for example, about let's say that we had health for the enemies, okay? The thing that we're going to have to deal with there is variables, because if let's say each enemy is going to have its own health, right? I can't have a thing called health. Basically, each enemy needs to have its own copy of a health variable. Does that kind of make sense? Right? So under variables, right, if you create one, the thing with so like, let's say we called this enemy health. Okay, so this is one thing that's a little different from Scratch. Those of you guys who did Scratch, do you remember there was there were two different kinds of variables that you could create? Okay, so what's the difference, or what are they? Yeah.
One applies to just that sprite, one applies all around the board.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the idea of a global variable versus a local variable. So a global variable is a variable that is accessible by the entire program, right? And you can only have one value of it. On the other hand, you could have a variable that only applies to a specific sprite, okay? That other parts of the program can't access. Only that sprite can access that variable. All right, when I created this variable enemy health, did I get an option to say whether or not it was a local versus global variable? I did not, okay? So in this particular language, there's no distinction between the two. Everything's global. Okay, that's going to be a little bit of a problem because we need a health thing to only apply to a specific sprite, right? So that this enemy can have its own value of health and that enemy has a different value, okay? Now, in a true object-oriented kind of thing, what you would do is you would say, like, let's say you've got two enemies called enemy 1, enemy 2. Each one could have its own health. Let's just say it's health. And then you would access that by saying something like enemy 1 dot health or enemy 2 dot health. And that would access the particular health variable for that object. But obviously they would be different. Enemy 1 dot health, or however it is different from enemy 2 dot health. Okay, so that's the mechanic we need to figure out for this. Okay, it's how to do sort of local variables. All right, what else was in our list? Okay, ammo meter. A lot of those different ideas would only apply to the player, and since there's only one player, we don't have to really worry about that. But the enemies we do. Okay. All right. So I think at this point, basically, let's just start mucking with it. Okay. So pick something to work on. I'm going to work on the health thing for the different enemies, and because I don't remember exactly how to do local variables here. That seems like as good a place to start as any. And I'll go ahead and quit the stream at this point because there's no point in streaming us just working. One other thing though before we get going is I wanted to make sure that everybody was clear on the next assignment. So, all right, so there's two assignments. What we're doing in class is assignment 1B. Okay, so basically when class ends, just a few minutes before the end, share your stuff, tell me what mechanic you decided to add. So I made it so, rather than just putting in a URL, you've got a text box where you can type stuff. So put in the URL and kind of tell me what you did. The other thing is, so like how you guys did when you were in that tutorial group, there were 3 different things. There was the silly short intro one, Space Explorer, which had a few parts. Then there was another one underneath that, which was to kind of do the same sort of thing, but for a platformer, right? We're going to do the same sort of thing on Tuesday, right? So do the platformer tutorials before Tuesday, and then in Tuesday's class, we'll talk about, you know, what can we add, how can we change things, that sort of stuff, okay? Good? All right. Quit the stream, and let's get to work.
You don't need that tutorial certification, do you?
No, yeah. I mean, you can show it to me if you want, but you mean you're not going to print it and put it up on your
Well, I just
refrigerator?
printed out the one, but, like,
Yeah.